When you picture a Viking, what do you see? Tall warrior, braided beard, angry eyes, massive axe, and, of course, the horned helmet. Now here's the twist. That Viking is not from the Viking Age. He's from the 1800s. Yes, your mental Viking is basically a 19th century cosplay influencer. The real Vikings didn't invent that look. Opera costume designers did, which means your authentic Viking is historically accurate in the same way a Marvel movie is a documentary. Welcome to History by Nature, where history isn't just written by winners, it's written by weather, coastlines, and people who desperately needed a cool origin story. The first big lie: Vikings were a people. Let's start with the first branding crime. Vikings weren't one unified nation called Viking Land with a single group chat and matching merch. Viking was more like a job title. As in, hi, I'm Eric, I'm a farmer. And on weekends? Ah yes, international maritime violence. So the 1800s idea of Vikings as one single warrior people? That's myth logic. History is messy. Myth is clean. Myth fits on a poster. And in the 1800s, posters were basically the internet, but with more tuberculosis. The real origin story. Geography made them sea people. Want the real Viking origin story? Don't start with a helmet. Start with a map. Scandinavia is not one big flat farm. It's a coastline that looks like it was designed by someone trying to win a maze competition. Fjords, islands, narrow waterways. A landscape that says, congratulations, you now speak boat. When your world is chopped into water corridors, boats become highways, ports become power, and distance becomes optional if you can sail it. So the Viking Age isn't random barbarian energy. It's what happens when geography hands humans a fast travel system. The cheat code, rivers, nature's freeway system. And here's the part the myth ignores. Vikings didn't just do oceans. They used rivers like nature's back door. Rivers are basically the original Google Maps route that says, avoid tolls, avoid checkpoints, avoid consequences. You can go inland by boat, pop up near rich towns, and act surprised. Oh, wow, look at all this silver you have. Would be a shame if someone professionally acquired it. This is why Vikings were scary, not because they were magically stronger, but because geography gave them mobility, and mobility is power. Why the 1800s needed Vikings? Nationalism era, the cringe arc. Now jump to the 1800s. Europe enters its nationalism era, aka, everyone suddenly discovers they have a soul and it's shaped like a flag. Borders shift. Empires flex. People panic. And nations start asking, who are we? No, seriously, who are we? Because the neighbors are doing speeches again. Scandinavia didn't have Roman ruins on every street corner. So they went, okay, what do we have? Sagas, sea warriors, epic ancestors. Perfect. The 1800s basically looked at Norse history and said, we can build a brand out of this. And once a brand is born, accuracy becomes a suggestion. Romanticism. History, but make it emotional and hot. Romanticism arrives and says, history is not about facts. History is about vibes. The 1800s loved epic heroes, tragic destiny, wilderness pure culture, masculinity you can bottle and sell as cologne called Fjord. So Vikings became symbols of strength, freedom, natural toughness, heroic suffering, and we were definitely never the bad guys. We were just misunderstood with axes. And once you turn people into symbols, you stop asking annoying questions like, wait, weren't they also slave traders? Shh, we're branding. Put it in the footnotes, in tiny font, under the merch link. The horned helmet. A stage prop that escaped containment now, the horned helmet. Did Vikings wear horned helmets in battle? Almost certainly not. Horns in combat are just handles for your enemy to grab. It's not scary, it's ergonomic. So where did horns come from? The 1800s, especially theater and opera costumes. Because on stage, you need instant recognition. How do we make these guys look Norse from the back row? Answer, put antlers on their head like they're a Scandinavian deer experiencing confidence. A theatrical design choice slowly became historical truth in pop culture. This is like if 300 years from now people think modern soldiers wore capes because Batman existed. which honestly feels inevitable. What the rebrand edited out, the real Viking system. Once Vikings became aesthetically profitable, the 1800s started editing the story. They highlighted exploration, bravery, craftsmanship, poetry, and downplayed raids on civilians, terror tactics, slavery, human trafficking, political violence, because the 1800s didn't want Vikings to be complicated. They wanted them to be inspirational. So Vikings became the ultimate fantasy combo, wild but admirable, brutal but honorable, terrifying. But somehow wholesome, basically. A man who burns your village, but respectfully. But the real driver is simpler and sharper. Geography plus economics. Ships tuned for rough coasts and shallow water. Rivers acting like arteries into Europe. Networks that blur trade and raiding. The Viking Age wasn't just yelling and axes. It was logistics wearing a beard. The cursed part? When a myth becomes a weapon. Now it gets darker. Once Vikings became symbols of strength and purity, they became useful for politics. In the late 1800s and beyond, Viking imagery gets used to sell ideas about superiority, purity, domination, destiny. Basically, Vikings became an ideological mascot. And that's why Viking imagery can feel complicated today. The curse of the 1800s rebrand is not just that it invented a fake Viking, it created a symbol people could hijack. History becomes dangerous when it becomes a weapon. Why Vikings matter? They helped shape the modern world, now zoom out. Why do Vikings actually matter beyond the helmet meme? Because mobility changes power. They connected regions through trade and violence. They founded settlements. They pushed navigation and shipbuilding forward. They altered political landscapes around coasts and rivers. They're a perfect history by nature example. Geography doesn't force people to act, but it makes certain actions easier, and easier actions get repeated until they become history. The sea was their road. Rivers were their ramps. And Europe was the parking lot. Reality check. The truth is way more interesting. Real Vikings were not fantasy barbarians. They were farmers, traders, settlers, mercenaries, and yes, raiders and slave traders. Not one uniform look, not one unified people, and no horned helmets in battle. The myth is loud, the truth is layered, and the truth is more cursed, because the real story is about ships, systems, geography, power, survival, not just axe go brr. So now you know, the Vikings you imagine weren't invented by Vikings. They were invented by the 1800s, artists, nationalists, and opera costume designers chasing maximum drama. The horned helmet isn't a historical artifact. It's a marketing decision. And honestly, that might be the most cursed part of all. If you enjoyed this nature-driven side of history, subscribe to History by Nature, where rivers, microbes, weather, and power keep ruining everyone's plans. Question for the comments: what's the biggest historical myth people still believe? And should we do the next episode, Vinland, Vikings in North America, what really happened? Because if the map says impossible, history usually replies, watch this.